The road to Elm Creek seemed endless. The orange cornfields stretching along the highway moved slowly, as if the land itself did not want to let the traveler go. The sky was thick gray, covered with heavy clouds that hinted at rain. The wind kicked up dust from the ground, throwing it in her face. Claire Lawson sat in her old sedan, gripping the steering wheel a little harder than necessary. She felt the nervous tension that had been building since she received the mysterious letter. The paper was yellowed and thin, like an old man's skin. There were only a few lines on it. Asterisk, come to Elm Creek. If you want to know the truth, find the scarecrow. It is the key to everything. The letter had no return address or signature. Why had she decided to come? This question had crossed her mind more than once over the past few hours. Partly out of professional interest. Her job as a journalist required her to respond to anything unusual. But there was also something else, something that touched her deep inside. Elm Creek was smaller than she had imagined. Not a single store or restaurant in sight. Just a few old houses along the main street covered in cracked asphalt. The sign at the entrance to the village was so old that she had to guess the name. She parked the car next to a building that had once been a gas station. The window panes were cracked, and the roof was overgrown with moss. There was a strange silence around, as if even the wind had avoided the place. Claire looked around. Not a single person, not a single sound. Only crows somewhere in the field. A smell caught her attention, a sweet, putrid odor. It came from the direction of the wide cornfield. She went off the road, making her way between the dry stalks. And then she saw it. An old scarecrow stood in the middle of the field, stooped and unsteady like a ghost. Its burlap head was attached to a cross, and its eyes looked like two black holes cut out carelessly. His clothes hung in tatters, like the remains of an old blanket that had rotted in the rain. But there was something strange about this image, something not quite right. Claire tried to get closer, but the ground under her feet became soft, as if saturated with water or something worse. The wind suddenly picked up, kicking up dry dust. The crows that were still perched on the crosspiece suddenly took to the air, raising a frantic cry. She stepped back. It seemed to her that the scarecrow's face had returned. Claire quickly walked back to the car. Her mind told her it was just her imagination, but her whole body felt something else, an uneasy whispering, as if something invisible, hidden in the field, was watching her. Getting into the car, she pulled out her notebook and started writing. First impression, asterisk, the scarecrow looks abandoned, but there is something strange. Could these legends be related to real events? Smell, asterisk, asterisk, rot, although there is no source nearby. Check. Location, asterisk, no one wanted to talk. Could there be an attempt to hide something? While writing, her pencil suddenly broke. She looked back at the field. The scarecrow was still there, but now it seemed closer. The next morning, she decided to find more information about the area. Claire visited the only library, a small, dusty room in the city council building. There were no computers, only old newspapers. She quickly came across an article from 1978, The Mysterious Disappearance of a Young Man in Simon's Field. The article stated that the man's body was found next to a scarecrow, but the cause of death remained unknown. The village had never made it public, and it was written off as an accident. The further she read, the more similar stories she found. Disappeared farmers, young workers, even children. All the cases came down to one, placed the same field where the scarecrow stood. The mystical guardian of the fields, as one article called him, maintains order by punishing criminals. The legend became part of the village's culture. Claire began to suspect that it was not just a fairy tale. That night, Claire went to the field again. She took a flashlight and a tape recorder. The cracked paths led her to the scarecrow, which now seemed even bigger and more terrifying. As she was recording, she heard something unusual. Not the sound of her footsteps or the rustling of the leaves, but something deeper, like a soft moan from the ground. She leaned closer to the base of the scarecrow and saw old footprints from the ground that had been dug up. It looked like a grave, recently dug and abandoned. She could hear the crows crying and knew that there was more to this place than meets the eye. Claire spent the rest of the night in a rented house on the edge of the village, but sleep never came. She sat at the table, looking through the notes and photographs taken near the scarecrow. In the pictures, everything looked familiar. The scarecrow stood motionless, crows circled over the field. But in one shot, she noticed something strange. In the background, between the stalks of corn, she could make out a human figure. Was it just a coincidence, a reflection of a branch, or a play of light? But her heart told her otherwise. Something about this village was not what it seemed. The morning began with a thick fog enveloping Elm Creek, making it look even more isolated. Claire headed to a local coffee shop to observe the inhabitants. Her goal was to find someone who could tell her more about the legend, but everyone avoided her gaze. Sitting at a table by the window, she finally spotted an old man. His clothes were shabby and his skin was covered with wrinkles, but his eyes betrayed alertness and a sharp mind. He was sitting off to the side, leisurely drinking coffee and looking out the window at the people bustling about on the street. Claire came over and sat down cautiously next to him. "You're new," he said after a long pause, not even turning to her. She did not object. "It seems you know more than you're willing to say." The old man smiled. It was a crooked smile, with no warmth in it. "Have you come for the legends? People are always looking for things that are better left alone." He explained briefly. The scarecrow was part of the village's history long before he was born. The guardian of the fields, as he was called, appeared when the founders of the village were fighting famine and plague. The scarecrow was supposedly protecting the harvest, but it was always associated with casualties. The old man suddenly stopped and added, almost in a whisper, "Do you know why no one touches it? Because those who touched it never came back." The old man's words left a heavy residue in Claire's mind. But instead of giving up, they only pushed her to continue. She went to a local church that also had an archive. A small room with old books and yellowed papers was the perfect place to dig up history. Claire found several records of the mysterious disappearances the old man had talked about. They were scattered over different decades, but they all had one thing in common. All the victims were last seen near a field where a scarecrow stood. She was most impressed by the record from 1923. It was about a family trying to leave Elm Creek after their son went missing. The next morning, their carriage was found empty on the outskirts of town, and their belongings were scattered in the middle of the road. None of the family members had shown up again. She noticed another disturbing detail. A shadowy figure was present in every disappearance. A tall man in a hat, or an unclear silhouette near a scarecrow. It seemed fictitious, but the number of references made Claire doubt it was a coincidence. The next night, she went to the field again. This time, she was accompanied by an unexplained feeling that someone was watching her. She walked confidently along the path, her flashlight illuminating the way, but the shadows grew longer, as if they were stretching behind her. As she approached the scarecrow, Claire pulled out her camera. She wanted to capture every detail. But when she pointed the lens at the burlap face, her hand trembled. In the light of the flashlight, it seemed that something was slowly leaking out of the holes cut for the eyes. She inhaled and took a few steps forward. The ground beneath her feet was soft, almost muddy. Her boots sank into the soil, and as she tried to pull her foot out, she felt something hard beneath the surface. She bent down and started to dig. Her fingers came across something smooth and cold. She pulled out an old button, but something else appeared with it. Fingers. Human fingers, wrinkled and gray, like a body that had been underground for decades. Claire jumped back, falling on her back. The flashlight dropped from her hand, and she was left in the dark. Panic gripped her, but she could feel something moving nearby. The rustling of straw and a sound like heavy footsteps came closer and closer. Claire gathered the remnants of her courage, got up, and ran to the road. Her breathing was ragged, but she kept going. It seemed like shadows were following her, but when she turned around, there was no one behind her. When she reached the car, she started the engine and drove out onto the main highway, trying to collect her thoughts. Her camera was left in the field, but she managed to take the button with her. With trembling hands, she put it on the seat next to her and drove off in the direction of the city council. One thing was clear. The legend of the field watchman was more real than she wanted to believe. She needed to find more answers, but now she realized that it would be much more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Claire couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. After she returned from the field, strange things began to happen in the house. At night, she would hear creaks as if someone was walking in the next room. The shadows outside the window, which at first glance appeared to be tree branches, seemed too much like human figures. It was hard for her to decide whether this was just the result of nervous tension or whether something had actually become real. The button she found in the field was haunting her. Its shape and texture resembled something old-fashioned, from another era. Under the microscope she had found in the town library, she could see tiny scratches on its surface, as if it had been pulled off someone's clothes by force. The next day, Claire decided to talk to the old man again at the coffee shop. She found him at the same table where he had been sitting earlier. His face was serious this time, and he didn't even say hello. When she put a button in front of him, his hand twitched and his eyes narrowed. "Get it away from me," he snarled. "It's none of your business." But Claire didn't give up. "It's a button from the field. I think it belonged to one of the missing people. Tell me what you know." The old man stood up abruptly, throwing a few coins on the table. "Listen, girl. Some things are better left untouched. People here are afraid for a reason. If you keep digging, you'll be next." He left her alone, but his words only spurred Claire to action. She went to the city council to find any official documents that might reveal the truth. In a dark corner of the archive, she found an old map of the village. All the fields were marked on it, including the one where the scarecrow stood. Next to this field was an inscription in red ink. Asterisk, cursed place. Do not touch. Even more interesting was the record of a court hearing in 1912. It was about farmers who accused each other of the disappearance of a young girl. The case was closed due to lack of evidence, but the last paragraph of the report was extremely strange. Asterisk, the accused claimed that the culprit was the field watchman. The court found these words inappropriate for consideration. That night Claire could not sleep. Her house seemed to breathe with her. The creaking of the boards became so loud that she decided to check it out. With a flashlight in hand, she went through every room. There was nothing, but when she returned to her room, she saw something that stopped her heart. The button she had left on the table was now lying on her bed pillow. Her fingers trembled, but she forced herself to pick it up. Underneath, it was a note written in shaky handwriting. Asterisk, the field takes its own. The next morning was filled with a sense of inevitability. Claire decided to return to the field, trying to gather evidence that could prove that the disappearances were linked to a specific group of people. She guessed that the story of the field watcher was just a fiction that was used as a tool of fear. When she approached the scarecrow, she noticed that it looked different. The hands, made of branches, were scratched, as if someone had recently grabbed them, and the burlap on its head was damp, as if it had gotten wet from something sticky. Claire pulled out her phone to take a video, but when she turned on the camera, the image suddenly began to ripple. A loud crack came from the speaker, and the phone turned off. She took a step back and tripped over something hard. The ground around the scarecrow was covered with deep marks that looked like human handprints. And then she saw him, a silhouette. Someone tall stood at the edge of the field, between the corn stalks. He did not move, but his presence pierced her with fear. Claire froze, her heart pounding like a hammer. The silhouette took a step forward. Its long legs stretched out as if it were not human, but then she saw something even more terrifying. His face was covered with burlap, like a scarecrow. Claire screamed and ran. She didn't know if the silhouette was following her, but the sound of corn stalks behind her was too real to ignore. She made it to the car, out of breath and scared. But when she started the engine and looked back in the rearview mirror, she saw a silhouette standing at the edge of the field, not moving. It was no longer a legend. The watchman of the fields was a reality. But now Claire knew it wasn't something supernatural. It was someone hiding behind a mask of fear, someone who had been ruling this village for years, using terror as a weapon. She had to uncover this mystery to the end. But now she knew that the hunt for the truth could cost her life. Claire woke up in the middle of the night. In the darkness of the house, which creaked with every movement of the wind, she felt the presence of something alien. It seemed that she was being watched. Her breathing quickened, and her skin became covered with orphan lines when she heard faint footsteps in the silence. They came from downstairs, from the living room. Clutching the flashlight in her shaking hand, she moved cautiously downstairs. The floor under her feet made a barely audible creak. In the center of the room, next to her belongings, was a doll made of straw and fabric, similar to the scarecrow she had seen in the field. With trembling fingers, she leaned toward it. A note was taped to the doll's chest. "You are going too far." Cold sweat trickled down her back. Someone had broken into the house. This is no longer a legend, but a real threat. The next day, Claire returned to the city library. In the dusty archives, she searched for names related to the history of the village. From the piles of documents, she managed to piece together the history of the influential Reynolds family. They own a large part of the land and maintained order in the village through fear. The scarecrow became a symbol of their power, a way to control people. Among the documents, she found another Record court report from the early 20th century. It was about the accusation of farmers in the disappearance of a girl. Although the case was closed, the documents mentioned that the last time the girl was seen was near a field where there was a scarecrow. This was the last piece of evidence that connected all the events. Claire decided to return to the field. She knew there must be something there to confirm her suspicions. Armed with a lantern and a shovel, she set off into the darkness, where a thick fog enveloped the ground. The scarecrow stood like a silent sentinel. The ground around it was soft. She began to dig under the cross. Each movement was slow, filled with fear. The shovel hit something hard. She threw away the earth and saw an old casket. The lid was rotten, but there were remains inside, human bones. Her hands were trembling, but she took a picture of the discovery. Her heart was pounding as she realized that these bones belonged to one of the missing victims. But now the question remained: who was behind it? As Claire was about to leave the field, she felt something change. The darkness thickened, and she heard footsteps. She turned around and saw the silhouettes of several men moving through the fog. They approached silently, forming a circle around her. Jack Reynolds stood at the head. His eyes were cold, and he was holding a shovel. Her camera was snatched from her by one of the men. Her heart sank as Jack came closer. The men began to dig a hole next to the effigy. The air became heavy, and it was harder and harder to breathe. Suddenly the field was illuminated with a bright light. With a dull roar of engines, a police car drove into the field. The headlights scattered the shadows, and the men froze like predators caught in the night. It was the local sheriff, who had been interested in Claire's car left on the side of the road. She seized the moment, broke free, and ran to the car. Her heart was pounding, and her lungs were burning when she reached the police officer. He asked her what had happened, but Claire was at a loss for words. She just pointed at the men in the field, but they had already begun to dissolve into the fog, leaving only a silent effigy. That night, she left the village, but the fear remained with her. She managed to escape, but the truth she discovered was even more terrifying. Her discoveries could change everything, but she knew that going back to Elm Creek could cost her life. Claire did not return home that night. She stayed in a cheap motel outside the village, trying to collect her thoughts. She couldn't shake the image of the shadows that had chased her across the field. Her discovery, the bones under the scarecrow, was irrefutable proof. But it wasn't enough to expose Jack Reynolds and his men. On the table in front of her was a camera that she managed to take back. The pictures taken on the field were blurry, but clear enough to show the pit and the remains. Claire knew this was only the beginning. Those behind these disappearances would not leave her alone. Morning brought a silence that was too loud. She could feel every nerve in her body tightening as she started the car. She had to get to the city to hand over the materials she had collected to her editor and the police. There were no other cars on the highway, only long, straight roads through empty fields. She held the wheel, expecting something to happen at any moment. The feeling of danger was so strong that she kept looking in the rearview mirror. On the horizon, far from the road, she saw a familiar field and the silhouette of a scarecrow. Even at that distance, it looked like a living being watching her. A few hours later, she arrived in the city. The police station was her first stop. Claire handed over photos, recordings, and her notes, insisting that an investigation was needed. The officers were skeptical at first, but when they saw the photos and the description of the findings, the atmosphere changed. Claire left the police station relieved, but one thought kept running through her mind. Would this evidence be enough to convict the Reynolds? The next few days were spent waiting. Claire stayed in town, following the news from Elm Creek. She was afraid to return home, realizing that she was now a target. A few days later, the local newspaper ran an article about her investigation. It mentioned the legends of the scarecrow, the remains found, and how the village had been hiding the truth for years. No names were mentioned, but it was clear to everyone who was behind it. But in the morning, when she opened her email, an unsigned message was waiting for her. Asterisk, you made a mistake. Claire returned to her home a few weeks later. She hoped it was over, but even within the familiar walls, she did not feel safe. All the curtains were closed tightly, and every sound seemed suspicious. One evening, when sleep was beginning to envelop her, she heard something at the door. A barely audible rustle, as if someone had left something on the threshold. She got up, cautiously opening the door. On the threshold was a straw doll, an exact replica of the one she had found in the house in Elm Creek. A note was sewn to its chest. Asterisk, we are always here for you. Claire froze, feeling fear envelop her completely. She looked around, but saw nothing suspicious. But her heart already knew the truth. The story was not over. The last scene, she returns to the house and closes the door tightly. Outside the window, among the shadows, she can see a figure that looks like a scarecrow. Its head is tilted to the side, and its eyes are gaping with emptiness. Is it over?